The forest was eerily silent, the wind whispering through the trees like ghosts murmuring secrets. In the distance, a German shepherd staggered through the underbrush, its fur matted with blood, eyes filled with desperation. Alone, exhausted, it fought for its life, until an unexpected figure emerged from the shadows. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forgotten edges of town where few dared to venture. Here, abandoned warehouses stood like silent sentinels, their broken windows reflecting the fading light. A lone German shepherd limped through the desolate alley, its fur a tangled mess of dirt and dried blood. Each step was labored, each breath a struggle, yet it pressed on. The dog had once been powerful, a protector, a guardian, but now it was nothing more than a wounded warrior, left to fend for itself in a world that had turned cruel. Hunger clawed at its stomach, a gnawing emptiness that had become all too familiar. Its ribs pressed against its skin, a stark contrast to the strength it had once carried. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of traffic hummed, a world of warmth, food, and comfort that was no longer within reach. The shepherd paused beneath a flickering street lamp, its amber eyes scanning the darkness for threats. Memories surfaced, unbidden and painful. Once, it had known love, a home, a name. The warmth of a hand scratching behind its ears. The scent of morning coffee and freshly cut grass. The laughter of a boy, no older than 10, whose arms had once wrapped around its neck in pure, unwavering trust. But that life had been torn away. The boy's parents had fought, a storm of raised voices and slammed doors. Then came the day when the leash was clipped onto the shepherd's collar, not for a walk, but for a ride that ended in a place it did not recognize. The car door had opened, a command had been given. Go. At first, the dog had waited, certain that the boy would return, that his scent would fill the air again. But hours turned into days, and realization struck like a cruel wind. He had been abandoned. The shepherd had learned to survive, navigating the brutal city streets, avoiding dangers that lurked in the night. It had fought for scraps, for shelter, for a reason to keep going. But this time, the fight had been different. This time, it had barely escaped with its life. Its last battle had been over food, one desperate mistake, one moment of weakness that nearly cost it everything. The alley was unfamiliar, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. Its ears twitched, listening for any sign of danger, but the world had gone quiet. Too quiet. Now, under the dim glow of the street lamp, its legs threatened to give out. The world tilted. Its strength was fading. The shepherd let out a low, ragged breath and sank onto the cold pavement, eyes fluttering shut. And then, footsteps, soft, hesitant, approaching. A voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "Hey there, buddy. You okay?" The shepherd's ears twitched, but it lacked the strength to move. The voice belonged to a man, young but weary, carrying the weight of something unseen. The scent of rain and old leather clung to him, familiar in a way the dog couldn't place. The man crouched, his hands open in a gesture of peace. His dark eyes scanned the shepherd's wounds, his jaw tightening at the sight. "You're hurt," he murmured, almost to himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of bread, stale, but it was food. The shepherd's nostrils flared, hunger momentarily outweighing caution. Summoning the last of its strength, it inched forward, took the offering, and swallowed without chewing. The man exhaled, relieved. "That's it. You're a fighter, huh?" The shepherd's gaze met his, and something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. They were both lost, both wounded in ways deeper than flesh. A gust of wind howled through the alley, rattling the old metal shutters. The shepherd shivered, its body betraying its exhaustion. The man hesitated for only a moment before shrugging off his jacket. Slowly, carefully, he draped it over the dog's trembling frame. "You don't belong out here," he said softly. Neither do I. The shepherd didn't know this man, didn't know if trust was something it could afford. But as the warmth of the jacket seeped into its bones, as the man's presence warded off the looming darkness, it felt something it hadn't in a long time. Hope. The man sat beside the dog, leaning against the cold brick wall as the city pulsed beyond them. He pulled out an old, creased photograph from his wallet, staring at it for a long time. His fingers traced the edges as if it held the answers he sought. "I had a dog once," he admitted after a while. "His name was Duke. Best friend I ever had." His voice wavered, thick with memories. "Lost him when I lost everything else." The shepherd didn't understand the words, but it understood loss. It understood loneliness. The man sighed, rubbing his face before glancing down at his unlikely companion. "I don't know what your story is, but I can tell you've been through hell." He paused. "You don't have to keep fighting alone." The shepherd closed its eyes, listening to the rhythm of the man's breathing, the steady rise and fall like an anchor in the storm. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel so alone. The man let out a slow breath, leaning his head back against the brick wall, exhaustion weighing on him as much as it did the shepherd. He didn't know why he had stopped. Why, out of all the stray animals he had passed before, this one had made him pause. But something about the shepherd, the look in its eyes, the quiet resolve despite its broken body, felt achingly familiar. Maybe it was because he too had been abandoned. Maybe it was because, deep down, they were the same. And in that moment, sitting in the dimly lit alley, neither man nor dog knew what lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them had to face it alone. The night was growing colder, the wind howling through the alley like a mournful cry. The man, Ethan, shifted slightly, adjusting the jacket draped over the wounded shepherd. The city beyond the alley was alive, its neon lights flickering like distant stars. But here, in this forgotten corner of the world, it felt like time had slowed. Ethan let out a long breath, his fingers absently tracing the creased edges of the photograph in his hand. He hadn't looked at it in months, maybe years. It was worn from being folded and unfolded too many times, the ink slightly smudged from the rain that had soaked through his wallet on more than one occasion. The photo was of a younger him, smiling, carefree, his arm slung over the broad shoulders of a golden-furred shepherd with intelligent, loyal eyes. Duke, his best friend, his only real family. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing the lump in his throat back down. He had lost Duke long before he had lost himself. The accident had been swift, brutal. One wrong turn, one moment of distraction. The screech of tires, the sickening thud, the world spinning too fast for him to stop it. By the time he had gotten out of the car, Duke was already gone. The warmth had barely faded from his fur when Ethan had cradled him in his arms, whispering apologies into the cold night. After that, everything had unraveled. Ethan glanced down at the shepherd beside him. This dog was different. Scarred, leaner, battle-worn in ways Duke had never been. But there was something in those eyes, a defiance against the world that mirrored his own. "You remind me of him," Ethan murmured. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the wind. He never gave up either. The shepherd barely moved, save for the slight twitch of its ear. Its breathing was labored but steady. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his face. He knew what had to be done. The dog wouldn't make it through the night out here, not in this state. Pushing himself to his feet, Ethan reached down carefully, testing the shepherd's reaction. It flinched slightly, eyes flickering open, but there was no growl, just exhaustion, wariness. "Easy, buddy," Ethan soothed, crouching down again. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I promise." He wasn't sure if the dog understood him, but after a long, tense moment, the shepherd didn't resist as he carefully slipped his arms under its battered body. It was lighter than it should have been, ribs jutting out beneath Ethan's fingertips. That realization sent another pang through his chest. Slowly, he stood, cradling the shepherd against him. The dog let out a soft, pained whimper, but didn't fight. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped out of the alley, back into the world he had tried so hard to avoid. The walk to Ethan's apartment was slow, careful. He kept his steps measured, shielding the shepherd as best he could from the sharp gusts of wind. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into its usual late-night lull. The old apartment complex loomed ahead, its flickering porch light barely illuminating the cracked pavement leading up to the entrance. Ethan adjusted his grip on the dog, nudging the door open with his shoulder before stepping inside. The interior was just as run down as the exterior. Dim lighting, peeling wallpaper, the faint scent of mildew that no amount of cleaning could erase. Ethan's apartment was on the third floor, past the flickering hallway lights and the door that had been missing its number for months. He fumbled for his keys, the dog's weight pressing against him like an anchor. His muscles burned, but he didn't stop. Not until he had pushed open his door and stepped inside. The apartment was small, barely more than a single room with a kitchenette and a threadbare couch. A mattress was shoved into the corner, a pile of unopened mail scattered across the tiny dining table. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Safe. Ethan knelt down carefully, laying the shepherd onto the couch. The dog let out a low, pained exhale, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "You're safe now," Ethan said quietly. He moved to the sink, filling an old bowl with water before setting it down beside the couch. The shepherd's nostrils flared slightly, but it made no move to drink. Ethan frowned, concern settling in his chest. He needed to check the dog's injuries, but he wasn't a vet, just a guy who had seen enough wounds to know when things were bad. Sitting on the floor beside the couch, Ethan let his fingers ghost over the shepherd's fur, searching for the worst of the damage. Dried blood crusted its side, but the wound wasn't fresh. It had scabbed over, though infection was a risk. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Ethan murmured. The shepherd didn't answer, of course, but the look in its eyes spoke volumes. Ethan sighed, reaching for the small first aid kit he kept beneath the sink. It wasn't much, some bandages, disinfectant, painkillers, but it was better than nothing. "This is gonna sting," he warned, dampening a rag with antiseptic. The shepherd tensed as he pressed the cloth against the wound, a deep growl rumbling in its throat. Ethan paused, hand steady, but patient. "I know it hurts," he said softly. "But I need to do this, okay?" The shepherd's eyes flicked to his, the amber depths searching, weighing. Then, slowly, it relaxed. Ethan exhaled and got to work. By the time he had finished, exhaustion was creeping in at the edges of his mind. The shepherd was asleep again, its breathing steadier, its body finally at rest. Ethan leaned back against the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. What was he doing? He wasn't the type to take in strays. He could barely take care of himself. But as he watched the shepherd sleep, its body curled up beneath the old blanket he had draped over it, he knew he couldn't just turn away. Not this time. Ethan sighed, letting his head rest against the couch. "Guess we're stuck with each other now, huh?" he muttered. The shepherd didn't stir, but somehow Ethan felt like it had hurt him, and for the first time in a long time, the silence of the apartment didn't feel quite so empty. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the soft sound of breathing. For a brief moment, he forgot about the events of the night before, but as he blinked against the pale morning light filtering through the tattered blinds, reality settled back in. The German shepherd lay curled up on the couch, its ribs rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The wound on its side had stopped bleeding, though dried remnants of crimson still clung to its fur. It was alive. That was all that mattered. Ethan exhaled and rubbed his face. His body ached from sleeping on the floor, but he ignored it as he pushed himself up. The apartment was cold. The radiator had long since given up on working properly, and with winter creeping in, it was becoming harder to keep warm. He moved toward the small kitchenette, grabbing the last slice of bread from the counter. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. Instead, he tore the slice in half and placed a piece in front of the shepherd. The dog stirred, its ears twitching before its eyes fluttered open. "Morning," Ethan muttered. The shepherd lifted its head slightly, eyeing him warily. Hunger flickered in its gaze as it glanced at the bread, but it didn't move. Ethan frowned. "You gotta eat," he said, nudging the piece closer. The dog hesitated, then, with slow, deliberate movements, it stretched its neck forward and took the offering. It chewed carefully, as if expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. Ethan sat down across from it, watching. The shepherd's fur was still dirty, its body still weak, but there was something in its posture that had changed, something less guarded, less resigned. "You're a tough one," Ethan murmured. "Bet you've been through worse, huh?" The shepherd didn't answer, of course, but its ears twitched slightly, acknowledging his voice. Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Gotta figure out what to do with you." He hadn't thought about it the night before. He had just acted, driven by instinct. But now that the morning had arrived, the weight of responsibility settled over him. Keeping the shepherd wasn't exactly an option. He could barely afford food for himself, let alone a dog. But the idea of leaving it outside again, alone, wounded, after everything, it didn't sit right with him. Sighing, Ethan stood. "First things first," he muttered. "We gotta get you cleaned up." The shepherd tensed as he approached, its muscles tightening. Ethan paused, giving it space. "Relax, I'm not gonna hurt you." Slowly, carefully he reached out. The dog flinched slightly but didn't move away. "Good," Ethan murmured. "That's good." He grabbed a damp cloth from the sink and crouched down beside the couch. With slow, gentle movements, he began wiping away the dirt and dried blood. The shepherd remained tense, but it allowed him to continue. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As Ethan worked, memories surfaced, memories of Duke. The way he used to roll onto his back, kicking his legs in the air whenever Ethan tried to give him a bath. The way he would bark, excited and impatient, whenever he saw the leash in Ethan's hands. The ache in his chest returned, sharp and unrelenting. "You remind me of him," Ethan murmured. His voice was quieter this time, almost as if he were speaking to a ghost. Same stubborn look, same eyes. The shepherd's gaze met his, and for a fleeting second, Ethan felt something settle in his chest, something that had been missing for a long time. He finished cleaning the dog as best he could, then stepped back. "There," he said. "Not perfect, but better." The shepherd exhaled softly, its body less rigid than before. Ethan nodded to himself. "All right," he muttered. "Guess I better find you some real food." The corner store wasn't far, but Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder the entire way. He hated leaving the shepherd alone, even if just for a few minutes. The store's bell chimed as he stepped inside. The clerk, an older man with graying hair and tired eyes, barely glanced up. Ethan moved toward the back, scanning the shelves. The cheapest bag of dog food was still more than he could comfortably afford, but he grabbed it anyway. As he approached the register, he caught his reflection in the glass counter. He looked as exhausted as he felt, hollowed-out eyes, stubble darkening his jaw, clothes that had seen better days. The clerk rang him up, and Ethan slid over the crumpled bills in his pocket. The exchange was quick, wordless. As he turned to leave, the clerk's voice stopped him. "New dog?" Ethan hesitated. "Something like that." The older man grunted, nodding toward the bag. "Good choice. Shepherds are loyal. You take care of them. They'll take care of you." Ethan swallowed but said nothing. As he stepped back into the cold, his mind echoed with the words, "You take care of them. They'll take care of you." Back at the apartment, the shepherd was exactly where he had left it, curled up on the couch, its eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Didn't think I was coming back, huh? The shepherd blinked slowly, then shifted its gaze toward the bag in Ethan's hands. Yeah. Give me a sec. Ethan poured some of the kibble into an old bowl and set it down. The shepherd hesitated, glancing at him first before lowering its head to eat. Ethan watched in silence. Minutes passed before the shepherd finally sat back, licking its muzzle. It wasn't much, but it was the most it had eaten in a long time. Ethan ran a hand down his face. Okay, he muttered. So what now? He could try taking the dog to a shelter, but the thought made his stomach twist. He knew how overrun those places were, how some dogs never made it out. And if he was being honest, the idea of letting the shepherd go felt wrong. The dog had fought to survive, just like him. Maybe they weren't so different after all. Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, buddy, looks like you're stuck with me for now. The shepherd's ears perked slightly at the sound of his voice. Ethan huffed out a laugh. Guess I need to call you something, huh? The dog simply watched him, waiting. Ethan thought for a moment, then nodded to himself. How about Ghost? The shepherd didn't react, but Ethan could see the name settling into the space between them, unspoken but understood. Ghost it is, Ethan murmured. For the first time in years, the apartment didn't feel so empty, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel so alone. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, each one blurring into the next. Ethan and Ghost settled into an unspoken routine. Morning walks through the back alleys where no one would bother them. Quiet evenings where Ghost curled up beside the couch while Ethan sat staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. Ghost was healing. His wounds scabbed over, his ribs weren't as prominent as they had been that first night, and his eyes, once dim with exhaustion, now carried a quiet, knowing light. Ethan wasn't sure if he was healing too. He still woke up in a cold sweat some nights, dreams filled with things he didn't want to remember. The accident, the feeling of Duke's body in his arms, the way life had unraveled after that, one mistake leading to another until he had ended up here, scraping by in a run-down apartment, living paycheck to paycheck when he could even find work. But Ghost gave him something to wake up for. Never thought I'd be a dog person again, Ethan murmured one evening, glancing at Ghost. The shepherd lifted his head at the sound of his voice, ears perked slightly. Ethan smirked. Yeah. Don't get all sentimental on me. Ghost huffed and laid his head back down. But the peace wasn't built to last. Ethan should have known. It started with a knock at the door. Not the casual kind. Not the kind that came from someone stopping by. This was sharp, deliberate, filled with something Ethan didn't like. Ghost immediately lifted his head, ears twitching toward the sound. His body tensed, that old survival instinct kicking in. Ethan stood, his stomach twisting as he approached the door. He barely cracked it open before a hand shoved it wider, forcing him back a step. Well, look who finally decided to answer, a familiar voice sneered. Ethan clenched his jaw. What do you want, Ray? Ray Connolly was the kind of guy who thrived on other people's failures. He had a thin, wiry frame, but there was something in his eyes that made him dangerous, something unpredictable, like a loaded gun with the safety off. You got something that belongs to me, Ray said, stepping inside without permission. Ethan didn't move. I don't owe you anything. Ray's lips curled into a smirk. Yeah? See, that's where you're wrong. His gaze flickered past Ethan, landing on Ghost. His expression twisted. That's the dog, isn't it? Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. What are you talking about? Ray snorted. Don't play dumb. That mutt? He belonged to a guy I used to do business with. Nasty bastard. Used to run fights underground. Bet on dogs like him to make a fortune. Then one night, the guy turns up dead, and his prize fighter goes missing. Guess where I find him? Ethan's hands curled into fists. That's not your dog. Ray shrugged. Maybe not. But I know guys who'll pay real good money to get him back in the ring. Ghost had gone completely still, watching the conversation unfold with wary eyes. Ethan's heart pounded. He's not going anywhere. Ray chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You think I'm asking? His hand darted toward his pocket. Ethan reacted without thinking. His fist connected with Ray's jaw before he even realized he had swung. Ray stumbled back, cursing, but he recovered fast. Too fast. He lunged, grabbing Ethan by the collar and shoving him against the wall. Ghost was on his feet in an instant, a deep, guttural growl ripping through the room. The sound sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He had never heard Ghost make a noise like that before. Low, primal, dangerous. Ray hesitated. Call him off, he spat. Ethan smirked despite the grip on his shirt. You're scared of him, aren't you? Ray scowled but didn't let go. I don't walk away from what's mine. You never owned him. Ethan's voice was steady now, a quiet edge sharpening his words. And you're not taking him. Ray stared at him, his jaw tight. Then slowly, he released his grip and took a step back. Fine, he said, straightening his jacket. Have it your way, but don't think this is over. He turned toward the door, pausing only once to glance at Ghost. The shepherd didn't break eye contact, his body still poised like a coiled spring, ready to strike. Then Ray was gone. Ethan locked the door, pressing his forehead against it for a moment before exhaling. Ghost let out a soft whine, his body still tense with lingering energy. Ethan turned, running a hand through his hair. Looks like you've got enemies, buddy. Ghost blinked. Ethan sighed. Great, just what we needed. Ethan knew Ray wasn't bluffing. The guy was persistent, and worse, he had connections. The next few days, Ethan stayed on high alert, keeping Ghost close whenever they went outside. The air felt different now, charged with the constant possibility of something going wrong. And then, one night, it did. Ethan had just stepped outside to grab something from the corner store. It had only been a few minutes. Ghost had been curled up on the couch, and Ethan figured it would be safer to leave him behind. But when he returned, the door was ajar. Ethan's heart stopped. The apartment was dark. Too dark. A cold sense of dread crept into his bones as he pushed the door open, stepping inside with slow, careful movements. Ghost. Silence. Then, a sharp noise. A muffled whimper. Ethan's stomach lurched as he bolted into the apartment. Ghost was struggling against a heavy-set man dressed in black, a thick rope wrapped around his muzzle, holding him down. Ethan saw red. He didn't think. He just acted. With a burst of adrenaline, he slammed into the intruder, knocking him sideways. Ghost let out a strangled noise, his legs kicking as he tried to free himself. Ethan drove his fist into the man's ribs, fury turning his movements into something brutal, something unrelenting. The man grunted in pain but shoved Ethan back, scrambling to his feet. Ray was standing in the doorway, watching with an amused smirk. You really don't know when to quit, do you? He said. Ethan's breathing was ragged. Let him go. Ray gestured to his goon, who tightened his grip on Ghost. The shepherd let out a low, strangled growl, his body thrashing against the restraint. Here's how this is going to work, Ray continued. You hand over the dog, and we walk out of here. No trouble. Ethan's fists clenched. Not happening. Ray sighed, shaking his head. Shame. He snapped his fingers. The goon pulled something from his jacket, something metallic that caught the dim light. A knife. Ethan barely had time to react before the man pressed the blade against Ghost's side, just enough for the shepherd to let out a pained whimper. Ethan's world went still. A cold, terrible rage settled deep inside him. Last chance, Ray said. Ethan met Ghost's eyes. Despite the pain, despite the danger, the shepherd was still fighting. His body strained against the grip, his muscles coiled like a wire pulled too tight. Then Ethan saw it, that same spark, that same refusal to give in. And suddenly, He knew exactly what to do. He took a deep breath, then let his body go slack. "Fine," he said, raising his hands slightly. "You win." Ray smirked, stepping forward. "Smart man." Ethan moved faster than thought. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the knife-wielding man by the wrist and twisted. The knife clattered to the floor, and Ghost, freed by the momentary distraction, lunged. The shepherd's jaws clamped down hard on the goon's arm. The man let out a guttural scream as he stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. Ray's smirk vanished. Ethan turned to him, breathing hard. "Run." Ray hesitated. Ghost let out a deep feral growl, blood dripping from his teeth. Ray ran. Ethan sank to his knees, Ghost pressing against him. They had won. But the fight wasn't over yet. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a dull, aching exhaustion that seeped into Ethan's bones. The apartment was a wreck. The overturned table, the scuff marks on the floor, the broken lamp lying in shattered pieces by the couch. The air still carried the scent of sweat, fear, and the sharp tang of blood. Ghost sat beside him, his breathing heavy but controlled. His fur was ruffled, his muscles still tense, and his amber eyes flickered with something primal. A survivor's instinct. Ethan exhaled, pressing his fingers against his temple. "That was too close," he muttered. Ghost didn't move. He just watched Ethan, as if waiting for his next command. Ethan forced himself up, moving to the kitchen, his limbs sluggish. He grabbed a clean rag, wet it under the faucet, and returned to Ghost's side, kneeling down. "Let me see," he murmured. Ghost let out a small, tired huff, but didn't resist as Ethan examined the shallow cut on his side. It wasn't deep, but it had bled more than Ethan liked. "You really are a fighter," Ethan said softly, dabbing the wound with gentle hands. Ghost barely flinched. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of the city outside. But it felt different now, more dangerous. Ray wasn't gone. Not really. Ethan could still hear his last words ringing in his head. "You think this is over?" A bitter laugh escaped him. Of course not. He had bought them time, but that was all it was. Time. Ray wasn't the kind of man to take a loss lightly. He'd be back, maybe with more men, maybe with worse intentions. Ethan leaned back against the couch, running a hand down his face. He should leave, disappear before Ray could track him down again. But where would he go? He had spent years running, from his past, from his mistakes, from himself. And now? Now he had Ghost. The dog had fought for his life, and Ethan had fought for him in return. That had to mean something. He glanced at Ghost, who was watching him carefully. Ethan could see it now. How much the shepherd trusted him, how much they had already been through together. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like someone needed him. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess running isn't an option, huh?" Ghost blinked slowly, as if agreeing. Ethan let out a soft chuckle. Figures. The weight in his chest didn't disappear, but it settled. He wasn't alone anymore. And if Ray came back? Ethan wasn't going to let anyone take Ghost away. Not now. Not ever. The night passed in uneasy silence. Ethan barely slept. Every sound from the hallway outside made his pulse spike. Every creak of the old floorboard sent his nerves on edge. Ghost remained alert too, ears flicking toward every noise, his body tense even as exhaustion weighed him down. Ethan had been in bad situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. If Ray came back, he wouldn't hesitate to kill Ghost, or worse, take him back to the world he had barely escaped. Ethan wouldn't let that happen. Morning light spilled through the cracks in the blinds, painting the apartment in pale gold. Ethan sat on the couch, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He wasn't drinking it, just holding it, staring at the steam rising in soft curls. Ghost lay at his feet, his breathing steady but shallow. The fight had taken a lot out of him. Ethan sighed. "We can't stay here." Ghost's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. He had no money, no car, no plan. Just a half-healed dog and a problem that was quickly catching up to him. His mind flicked through options, but none of them seemed good. The shelters wouldn't take Ghost, especially not with his past. The police wouldn't do anything. Ray had connections that would make sure any report got buried before it even saw daylight. That left only one option. Ethan grabbed his jacket and stood. "Come on, buddy. We're leaving." Ghost groaned as he lifted himself off the floor, stiff but determined. Ethan grabbed the bag of dog food, stuffing a handful into his pocket before slinging the strap over his shoulder. They stepped outside into the biting morning air. The city was awake now, car horns blaring, people moving with purpose. Ethan kept his head down, Ghost close by his side. They had to disappear. Fast. The first place Ethan went was an old contact, someone who owed him a favor. Miles Keller had been a mechanic once, back before he got mixed up in things he shouldn't have. Now, he worked out of a rundown garage on the outskirts of town, fixing cars that didn't officially exist and keeping his mouth shut about the people who drove them. Ethan knocked on the rusted metal door, glancing over his shoulder. No signs of Ray's guys. Yet. A few moments later, the door creaked open. Miles squinted at him. "Ethan?" Ethan forced a smirk. "Miss me?" Miles huffed, stepping aside to let him in. The garage smelled like oil and cigarette smoke. Half-disassembled cars were scattered around, tools piled on every available surface. Ghost stuck close to Ethan's leg, sniffing the air warily. Miles raised an eyebrow. "Didn't peg you for a dog guy." Ethan ran a hand over Ghost's head. Things change. Miles studied them both for a moment before sighing. "Let me guess. You need a favor." Ethan nodded. "Something low profile. Something that can get us out of the city fast." Miles rubbed his jaw. "You in trouble?" Ethan didn't answer. Miles took another drag of his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. "All right, I got a guy. Works nights at a scrapyard near the docks. He's got a van. Nothing special, but it runs. I can make a call." Ethan's shoulders loosened slightly. "Thanks, man." Miles gave him a look. "I didn't say it was free." Ethan sighed. "What do you want?" Miles smirked. "Relax. Just need a set of hands. Got a car in the back that needs some work. Help me out and I'll square things with my guy." Ethan glanced at Ghost, then back at Miles. "Fine. But we do this fast." Hours passed. Ethan worked beneath the hood of an old sedan, grease staining his hands, the familiar ache settling into his muscles. It felt good. Simple. For a little while, he almost forgot about Ray, about the danger that was creeping closer. Ghost lay nearby, watching the entrance like a sentinel. Miles wiped his hands on a rag. "You still got it." Ethan chuckled dryly. "Didn't have much of a choice." Miles nodded toward Ghost. "That dog's different from the one that walked in here. More alert, more alive." Ethan exhaled, running a hand over Ghost's head. "Yeah, he's got something to fight for now." Miles tossed Ethan a set of keys. "So do you." Ethan caught them, gripping them tightly. It was time to go, but fate had other plans. The first gunshot shattered the quiet. Ghost was on his feet in an instant, growling. Ethan ducked behind the car, his heart hammering against his ribs. Miles cursed. "What the hell?" The garage door rattled violently, then burst open. Ray, flanked by two guys with guns drawn. Ethan's grip tightened around the wrench in his hand. Ray smirked. "Miss me?" Ethan's mind worked fast. No weapons, no escape. Just a wrench, an old garage, and a half-healed dog against three armed men. Not great odds. Ray stepped forward, gun hanging loosely at his side. "You made this harder than it needed to be, Ethan." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You're the one who broke into my place." Ray shrugged. "Should have handed over the dog when you had the chance." Ghost let out a low, warning growl. Ray's gaze flicked to him. Still got fight in him, huh? That's good. Means he'll fetch a high price. Something inside Ethan snapped. Before Ray could react, Ethan lunged, swinging the wrench with everything he had. The impact was brutal. Ray staggered back, cursing as the gun clattered from his grip. Chaos erupted. One of Ray's guys aimed his gun, but Miles tackled him from the side, sending the shot wide. The bullet hit a stack of tires, rubber shredding under the force. Ghost moved next. He leapt, his jaws snapping around the second man's wrist. A scream tore through the air as the gun fired harmlessly into the ceiling. Ethan didn't stop. He grabbed Ray by the collar, slamming him into the hood of a car. Ray spat blood, laughing. "You think this changes anything?" Ethan didn't answer. He just drove his fist into Ray's gut. The second man, still screaming from Ghost's bite, finally yanked free. He scrambled toward the exit, his injured arm hanging uselessly at his side. The first guy, the one Miles had tackled, was already out cold. That just left Ray. Ethan grabbed him by the shirt and dragged him toward the open garage door. "You come after us again," Ethan growled, his voice low and lethal. "I won't stop next time." Ray coughed, glaring up at him. "You're dead, Ethan. Both of you." Ethan tightened his grip. "Try me." Then he shoved him out into the dirt. Ray hit the ground hard, groaning. Ghost stood at Ethan's side, blood staining his muzzle, his breathing heavy but steady. Ethan exhaled, his pulse still hammering. Miles wiped his hands on his jeans. "Well, that was fun." Ethan shot him a look. "Fun isn't the word I'd use." Miles smirked. "Van's out back. Take it and go. I'll clean up here." Ethan hesitated. "You sure?" Miles nodded. "Go." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Ghost's leash, the shepherd following him without hesitation. They climbed into the van, the engine roaring to life. As they pulled onto the road, Ethan risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. Ray was still lying in the dirt, watching them go. For the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't running. He was moving forward, and Ghost was right there with him. The hum of the van's engine filled the silence as Ethan drove, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The city lights faded behind him, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the open road. Ghost lay curled up in the passenger seat, his breath steady, his body finally relaxing after what felt like an endless battle. For the first time in years, Ethan had no destination. And for the first time in years, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward something. He just didn't know what yet. The highway stretched ahead, lined with towering trees that swayed gently in the wind. The farther he got from the city, the lighter his chest felt. The weight of the past, of Ray, of the life he had barely survived. It all seemed to fade, mile by mile. Ghost let out a soft sigh, shifting slightly. Ethan glanced over at him, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "You good, buddy?" Ghost didn't open his eyes, but his tail thumped lightly against the seat. Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, me too." They drove for hours, stopping only when exhaustion forced Ethan to pull into a deserted rest stop. He parked beneath a flickering street lamp, stepping out into the crisp night air. Ghost followed, stretching his legs before sniffing the air, his ears twitching at the distant rustle of leaves. Ethan leaned against the van, watching him. "You ever lived outside the city?" he asked, knowing Ghost wouldn't answer. "Think you'd like it out here?" Ghost padded closer, pressing his nose against Ethan's hand. Ethan let out a slow breath, staring up at the sky. It had been years since he had looked at the stars like this. Without streetlights washing them out, without the constant hum of the city drowning out the silence. Something about it felt right. He wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew one thing. They weren't going back. The next morning, Ethan found a small town nestled between rolling hills, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the streets were lined with mom-and-pop shops and faded diners that had been there for decades. He pulled into a gas station, filling up the van while Ghost sat beside him, watching the handful of locals move about their morning routines. A woman exiting the gas station caught sight of Ghost and smiled. "That's a beautiful shepherd." Ethan glanced down. "Yeah, he's something special." She tilted her head. "You just passing through?" Ethan hesitated. "Maybe." She nodded toward a bulletin board outside the station. "If you're looking for work, folks around here always need an extra set of hands." Ethan followed her gaze. The board was cluttered with flyers, handwritten ads for farm work, mechanic jobs, even a place offering room and board for anyone willing to help with construction. Ghost nudged Ethan's leg, as if urging him forward. Ethan scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, maybe it's time for a fresh start." The woman smiled. "Good luck, stranger." Later that day, Ethan found himself standing in front of a small ranch on the outskirts of town. The owner, a gruff but kind older man named Bill, eyed him with curiosity. "You any good with your hands?" Bill asked. Ethan shrugged. "Used to be a mechanic. Can handle basic repairs. Hard work doesn't scare me." Bill's gaze drifted to Ghost. "And him?" Ethan glanced down at the shepherd. "He's been through hell, but he's loyal. Won't be a problem." Bill rubbed his chin. "I could use some help fixing up the barn. Got an old cabin out back. It ain't much, but it's got a roof and a bed. You do good work, you can stay as long as you need." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Deal." Ghost let out a small bark, as if approving. Bill chuckled. "Looks like he's got your back." Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I think we've got each other's backs." For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something close to peace. Maybe he and Ghost weren't just surviving anymore. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally found home. Sometimes, the ones we save end up saving us. Ethan thought he was rescuing Ghost, but in the end, Ghost gave him something far more valuable, a reason to keep going. Have you ever met someone, human or animal, who changed your life in ways you never expected? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes, a second chance is all it takes to find where you truly belong